watch the original movie, it's the discovery of the life cycle of this creature that is repulsive at every turn. But now we know what that is, right? So you've lost that discovery. I got away with things that I couldn't have gotten away with on my own. In other words, I could say, well, look, it's not that I want a 10-minute parable sequence, but it is a Coen Brothers movie, right?
Well, thank you for joining me for the Radio Times Writers' Room. So this is an opportunity to obviously speak about your excellent new show, Alien Earth, but also to delve into some of your previous projects and sort of get to know a bit about your process, essentially. My understanding is you sort of grew up around writing. You've got some writers in your family. Your brother's a screenwriter.
Yeah.
At what point did you know that this was the road you wanted to go down, that you wanted to be a writer, and what would you say was your biggest inspiration in making that decision?
Yeah, I think I started primarily as a songwriter, as a musician, and then realized at a certain point that a song can only get you so deep or into a complex thought, and I started writing fiction after college. I'd done some fiction writing in college, and then started mostly in my early 20s to think about being a novelist. And so that was the goal. I did not, get a degree, so I had to learn on the job, but my grandmother had been a writer. She had an 8th grade education. My mother had a high school education. She was a writer. So I always saw it as just something you say you are, and then you have to prove it by doing it, right? And so you write a novel, you go, there's a good idea in here. You put it in a drawer. You write another novel. That's better. Still in the drawer. It's a process, and you have to be okay with that. You have to be patient.
You mentioned you started out in novels. Was that a big transition to move over to screenwriting? And obviously you've come back to novels. Is it always a different thing?
A lot fewer words in a screenplay, but the same intention has to go into it. I think the danger of a document that only has action and dialogue is that you think that that's all the world is action and dialogue. And, a novel is concerned primarily with the interior states of characters, and you explore the thought process that gets you to the decision, right? And that work still has to be done on the screenplay, and both for yourself and for the actors and for the readers to say, oh, I see, especially if your characters are going to do unpredictable things or surprising things, the audience needs to understand and believe where that choice came from.
One of your first projects was a feature film, and you've since come back to another one. Is that a world you'd be interested in doing more? Would you be interested in doing more films, or do you feel more that TV is the area you're passionate about? No,
I like the feature film as a format. I found it interesting, when I made Lucy in the Sky a few years back. It's a finite object, right? The 2-hour movie, and on some level I'm used to in a 10-hour story of having some leeway of saying, well, this scene doesn't work here, but it would go great in the next hour. Mm-hmm. You have a finite amount and you have to make some choices. And there were, I remember on Lucy in the Sky, the script starts at a certain moment and takes you through this point, but in the editing room I thought, well, if we just start with her face and space taking in the vastness of everything, and then the next thing we see is her in the pickup line at school and the mundanity of daily life, you know right away that she's come back to a world that's a lot smaller than the one that she wants to be in.
Then one of your first TV roles, well, I think your first TV role was on Bones, wasn't it, as a staff writer. What was that experience like, sort of working to someone else's creative brief, I suppose?
Yeah, I think what so many writers struggle with in television is wanting to be a unique snowflake, right? The reality is when you're hired on a staff, your job is to write in the showrunner's voice, and to mimic as closely as you can how they tell a story. And so the job is not for me to write an episode of Bones. The job is for me to write a script that Hart Hansen can rewrite in his own voice, but that is structurally sound and has good details in it that maybe he'll preserve, maybe he'll play around with. You know, the best compliment I ever got on a staff was Hart telling me that I was a pleasure to rewrite. So, you know, it's just a different expectation. I mean, you're still making a ridiculous sum of money to do that, right? So the moment you bring ego into it and go, well, I'm really the genius writer, a writing staff is not the place for you to be.
And was there anything that you sort of learned from that experience that you've taken into running your own writers' rooms?
There was a lot, both things that I said I would do and things I was like, well, that's not how you do it. You know what I mean, in terms of how I would do it. I mean, you know, Hart, he did not want to be in the writer's room. He wanted the writer's room to do their thing and produce outlines and scripts that he could then read. And I thought, well, that's going to waste a lot of my time because I tell stories in a very specific way. So I need a writer's room that works more as a way for me to think out loud, right? I have to drive the process. Otherwise, you know, they're going to spend a day, a week working up a story that I'm going to reject in the first 5 minutes as like, no, that's not the right direction to go in. And, you know, my axiom is always maximum creativity, maximum efficiency, right? I couldn't get as much done as I get done if I wasn't a strong first draft writer, if I didn't write fast. You know, I have my instincts. I don't have a lot of creative doubt. When I like something, that's what we're doing. And then if something better comes along, you know, I'll adapt to it.
And then the first show you created was The Unusuals.
Yes.
Yeah. Which obviously, you know, has its fans, you know, and was well reviewed, but didn't quite make it beyond that first season.
You know, that was broadcast television in 2008 or whatever. You know, there was my sensibility. I couldn't make a great show. I could make a good show with a lot of pushback from the network about trying to make something more traditional. So, you know, on some level it was a losing battle. But what was interesting is the year before I had developed a pilot at ABC that was a more character-driven, less of a story engine show that they really loved the writing and the characters but couldn't wrap their minds around picking up. And so the next year I was like, well, I have fans there, so now I should if I want to get a show on the air, I should bring them something that has more of a story engine that they recognize, right? So I brought them a cop show, and then within that I used that genre to then really just do the same thing I was doing in the other show, which is a character-driven piece, but it has a familiar architecture to it that they understand.
You mentioned genre there. Is there a particular genre that you find most challenging to work in? Is there one you find most interesting? Like, is there one that you're drawn to?
No, I mean, the joy for me is they're all different, but they each have a sort of set of expectations and formulas that can be played with. And you know, when you elevate genre by you know, by being expansive with theme and rich with characters, it's kind of the best viewing experience, you know, is the elevated genre. Because, you know, like with Alien, the first thing I did was say, let's take the monsters out of it for a second. What's the show, right? What's the show about as a drama? How is it working? How's the character, the political situation on Earth? How is that all playing together? And then let's reintroduce the aliens, but let's do it in a way that plays into the themes of the show versus just say run away.
Yeah, I definitely want to dive more into Alien, but first, if we turn to Fargo, what was that first conversation like for that show? Was it with FX? Was it with the Coens? What was it?
It was with FX. I mean, the Coens had signed on in principle to the idea that we would make a television, that they would make a television show out of it, and if they liked the script, they would put their names on it, and if they didn't, you could just send the checks to whatever P.O. box they have. You know, they asked me, because I had worked there before, we're thinking of doing we're thinking of doing Fargo as a television show, and what do you think? And I went in and I said, well, at the risk of not getting the job, I don't think it's a television show, a serialized television show, recurring, because the thing that makes the movie special is the way that it ends, the fact that she's solved the craziest case of her career, and she's got 2 months until the baby comes, and he got the 3-cent stamp, and tomorrow's a normal day, and it says it's a true story. So if she woke up tomorrow and it was just another crazy Coen Brothers case, right, you couldn't say, it wouldn't be the same. But I said, but I could see an anthology series called Fargo, where each season is a different story that fills the same headspace, that same kind of Fargo state of mind.
And was it difficult on that first season, sort of trying to find the balance between sort of hewing close in as you say, the space and the tone to the original film, and then doing something different? Did you find that a difficult balance to find?
No, the first season actually, I won't say that it was easy, but I will say that I feel like I've been successful with that because I share a sensibility with the storytellers, and that tension between comedy and almost horror that is a Coen Brothers movie, is a tension that I really like to tell stories in. So, there were challenges certainly, but also under the auspices of making a Coen Brothers movie, I got away with things that I couldn't have gotten away with on my own. In other words, I could say, well, look, it's not that I want a 10-minute parable sequence, but it is a Coen Brothers movie, right? Now, of course, I did want a 10-minute parable sequence, but, you're able to say, because you can go, well, look, in A Serious Man, they opened in the shtetl, and in The Man Who Wasn't There, they had a UFO, so it's not like it's not in the work, right?
Mm-hmm. And obviously, you're very busy right now with Alien, but could there be more, Fargo? Could we?
Yeah, there could be more, certainly. I felt going into 5 that it was going to be the last one, and then halfway through making it, I was like, who am I kidding? This is a joy to tell stories in this voice, and so, as long as I keep having ideas, I'll keep telling stories.
And you're known, I suppose, for crafting these unique stories within these established worlds. Was that something you always set out to do? Was that something you were always interested in? Is working in established worlds like Marvel and like Alien?
No, not really. I mean, it's as much a surprise to me as anyone else. It did occur to me a couple of years ago that one of my earliest positive writing experiences was a high school class in which we were reading Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, and the teacher said, well, the assignment is to write your own chapter, of Catch-22 that captures the voice and the sensibility of the storytelling. And so I wrote a chapter of Catch-22, and I was like, oh, I understand instinctually what that voice is and how the comedy of it works, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I suppose it's not surprising that whatever it was 20, 30 years later, I got the Fargo assignment and responded to it in kind.
Mm-hmm. And you've had a couple of projects, sort of high-profile ones like Star Trek and a Doctor Doom movie and things which haven't worked out. Have you developed a resilience in those sort of situations? Is it difficult to get over those disappointments?
Yeah, I mean, it's the bigger the thing is, the harder it is to navigate the process, because the more money, the more fear, right? The more second guessing, etc. What happened with Doctor Doom is, this was a conversation with 20th Century Fox before Disney acquired them, and in which, I had a great script and that they were excited about, and then Disney came in and bought them, and of course now the Marvel properties that were controlled by Fox reverted back to Kevin and Marvel itself. And so I remember having a meeting with Kevin Feige where he said, I heard you wrote a Doctor Doom movie, are you still working on that? And I said, should I still be working on that? And Star Trek was, that was like a management change at Paramount, where we were on the runway, we had stages on hold, we were negotiating with actors, and this executive came in who worked there for about a year total and said, well, I think we need a transition movie. another Chris Pine movie that transitions us. And I was like, well, that's not what I wrote. And so you just have no control over it at that scale.
With mentioning Marvel, that seems like the perfect opportunity to move on to Legion.
Yeah.
How much of a Marvel Comics fan were you going into that show? And do you think fandom helps or hinders in these sorts of situations?
I mean, I was a big fan in my youth, X-Men fan. Teenage years, sort of the golden age, the Dark Phoenix, all of those stories that were so powerful. And so when the opportunity came around, they basically said, because again, this is pre-Disney, Fox had the X-Men rights. Was there anything in the X-Men world? And I did a similar thing that I mentioned, with Alien, where I said, let's take the monsters out of it for a minute. It was like, all right, well, let's take powers and all of that out of it. The show needs to work as a great drama, and what's interesting to me, and the first thought I had was, because Breaking Bad was at its height, and I thought, well, what if that was the story of a supervillain, creating a supervillain, right? And so then I look around at the roster of characters, and came upon this Legion character, and thought, well, that's really interesting that basically this is a story of Professor X's mentally ill son, right? And that there's something, in the comic, he has multiple personalities and the powers are different with it. That was a very complex idea, but this idea that you have a character who knows he's mentally ill because he's seeing things and hearing things that no one else is seeing, and weird things are happening around him that people say aren't real, and either he's mentally ill or he has these powers, well, that's a really interesting place to make a show. And, Marvel, to their credit, they were very supportive. I assumed, you've seen Legion, it's a super surreal show. I assumed that, my notes call with Marvel would be that just 40 minutes of them going, we don't really know what you're doing. But, they were very supportive.
And then I love the story, obviously, that Aubrey Plaza's character, Lenny, was originally written for a middle-aged man. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was whatever, the dude at the psychiatric hospital that David befriends. I don't know, there's writing and there's casting, and there are different processes, and for whatever reason, the tone of voice of the character on the page just made me think of Aubrey. And, so I had a meal with her, and she's like, hey, man, I'm good. Whatever you want to do. You don't even have to change the name, So she was a pleasure.
Well, speaking of writing and casting being separate, do you ever write with an actor in mind for a particular role?
I've only really done it one time. When I had the idea for the fourth season of Fargo, which was a period piece, 1950, these two crime families that trade their youngest sons, and it was the Italian mob and the black gang there in Kansas City. For whatever reason, Chris Rock arrived with the idea in my head, and so, we got Chris on board before I'd written anything, and he was a fan of the show, and so. But even then, if you've watched it, it's not a comedy performance; it's a dramatic performance, which I'm not sure anyone else would have written for Chris Rock at that time. But there was something about his tone of voice and the way he came up that was resonant to me.
And now, if we turn to Alien. You've already mentioned, obviously, that initially it's let's take the alien out of it and work out what the story's going to be. What was the first crux of that? Was it that it's set on Earth? Was it the situation with Wendy and her newfound siblings? What was the sort of first nugget that you came to?
Well, it was Ian Holm, really, is what it was. It was the fact that you're over an hour into this movie, which you think is a monster movie, and then suddenly Ian Holm is an android. And this idea, suddenly this is a movie about, we're escaping the past in which we were food into the future, and now the future's trying to kill us, right? This monster we created is trying to kill us. And the thought, well, that's a really interesting place to tell a story. And so and obviously the various filmmakers have, Fassbender and Winona Ryder, and every movie has its synth, and I just thought, well, what if we're in a moment in which, we have these synthetic bodies, but we also have a corporation that's trying to enhance biological bodies with, neural implants and cyborg body parts, and then what if we have this transhuman story as well? And that kind of led me, for whatever reason, to, well, what if they're not adults? What if they're kids? And then that was to write to Peter Pan, and now you have a show.
And is that difficult, writing children who are now in adult bodies? Is there a difficulty finding the voice there? How do you...
Well, I mean, it's whatever it is, 5 or 6 different voices, right? But yeah, I mean... There were some nerves around it with FX in the early days. I think when we think of children in adult bodies, we think of Will Ferrell, right? And it's like, well, I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, children are actually quite graceful and noble and thoughtful, and yeah, some are playful and some have ADD and some whatever, but we have that full spectrum. I think what was intimidating about it is that I'd never really seen it done before, and it was a lot to hang a series on something that you've never seen done before, but isn't that what makes it exciting?
Well, another challenge, I imagine, was coming to a franchise which has always been films and then building that story out for a full series. What was how did you approach doing that? Was that a difficult tension to...
Yeah, I mean, you just have to know what the two things are, right? I mean, fundamentally, an alien movie is a survival story, a 2-hour survival story in which 1 or 2 people are going to live. And a television series can't be that. It is a multiple hour, sometimes 50-hour recurring story about a multitude of characters who don't die, right? And so it's built in a very different way. And yeah, you have the horror elements and the dread, and there is violence, and people do die. But it's fundamentally meant to be an ongoing story, and so you have to build it in a different way.
You also introduced some incredible new alien creature characters here. How do you go about designing those in your mind? Is it from a visual standpoint? Are you thinking about what they're going to look like on screen, or are you thinking about what they can do? How do you?
Yeah, it's in the writing. It's in the writing standpoint of, I mean, what I'm trying to do is fill a void that when you watch the original movie, it's the discovery of the life cycle of this creature that is repulsive at every turn. But now we know what that is, right? So you've lost that discovery process. So the new creatures allow you to do that again, and the audience is like, wait, what does it eat, and how does it reproduce? And so, in the writing stage, it was really about the functionality of it, and the design came later.
And when you're approaching something which is within a franchise like this, are you thinking at all about how this fits in with canon and all that sort of stuff, or do you try and put that aside and say this is our completely separate thing?
I mean, it's got to be what it is. It's got to be its own thing, and that there's touchstones, there's references. I mean, same on Fargo of saying, all right, well, there's, I'll take a little Lebowski, I'll take a little, this tone of voice or this element. The fact that, in the James Cameron movie, you had Newt and Bill Paxton, and she's a child who acts like an adult, and he's an adult that acts like a child, and you think, okay, well, that tone of voice is there, right? So now when you have these adults who are acting childish, you're like, well, that voice is in Alien already.
And what does bringing the action of this series to Earth do to the story? What does it do to Alien in comparison to what we've seen before?
Well, it makes it less abstract. I mean, I think that the reality is that none of us have ever been on a spaceship before, right? That's not our environment. But once you see these creatures next to a tree, right, or in a yard, these are places that we live, right, and we live in homes, and there was something about introducing these creatures into an actual ecosystem that that offers a lot of both visual and storytelling ideas.
You've already mentioned the sort of tie-in to Peter Pan that's here, and then we also see on screen bits of Ice Age and things like that. Are you able to talk a little bit about this show's interest, or your interest in writing this in some of the pop culture, I suppose, from our time?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're still listening to songs that were recorded 100 years ago that, it's not that far away when you think about it. So projecting into the future 100 years, it's about creating a world that is recognizable to an audience as their own. And the problems of it are recognizable to them. And there's something that is universal and timeless is, we have these children, we're trying to raise them right. We have to send them out into a world that is a hostile and unpredictable place, and we want to prepare them, and we worry about it. And so, when you take a 12-year-old child and you just put her in an adult body and then surround her with a lot of people who aren't necessarily their best selves, the audience is going to worry. They're going to say, you need to take care of that child, right? And you need to teach that child better, and you need to be a better adult so you can be a role model for her. And so it's not a surprise when this human child who's in a synthetic body starts to go, well, is human really what I want to be? I mean, if this is what human beings do to each other.
And I know it's already been discussed that the show isn't sort of intended as a limited series. It could run and run. How far ahead do you sort of think about potential plot lines for how it could continue?
I mean, there's journey and there's destination, right? And I think in order to understand what the story means, I have to know where it's going. That doesn't mean I got to go up every stair now, but I know what the 5th floor is or the 6th floor is, right? So, it's the same process in writing a novel. Is like, I don't want to outline it. Once I outline it, I take all the discovery, the mystery out of it. I want to know just enough so that I can play with the material, right? I mean, Legion was a show in which I was like, look, I want to have an overview for the season, and I want to know, okay, this is the episode where, David's locked in his mind, and Sid has to go and figure out which of his memories are real, right? And then I sit down and I open in an ice cube with Jermaine Clement. I was like, well, that's not where I thought I was going to start, right? And this Alien, of course, is not a surreal show where you start in a literal ice cube, but there is a sense of, I'm watching the movie as I'm writing it, right? I'm feeling it as I'm creating it, and the outline part of your brain is a list-making part of your brain, and the writing part of your brain is a creative part of your brain. And I've done too much outlining in my life where I get to script and I was like, I don't want to do any of that, right? That's not where the story wants to go when I'm in the writing part of my brain.